Welcome! Today's topic is assessing and training the lower abdominals, specifically the lower fibers of the obliques. If you've watched some of my videos, you will understand how spinal positioning along with core function, especially those muscles of the inner unit, are important in any sport or activity, along with injury prevention and recovery. This exercise and its progressions require one tool which can easily be found on Amazon.com. It's the Chattanooga Stabilizer, a biofeedback device that greatly enhances the effectiveness of the exercise while increasing self-awareness and proprioception. Similar to a blood pressure cuff, it has an inflatable bladder, squeeze bulb, along with a larger, easier to read gauge attached by a longer tube. Before we get to the exercise itself, I need to define three pelvic positioning terms: anterior tilt, posterior tilt, and neutral. When standing, imagine your pelvis is a bowl of water. An anterior tilt is where the water pours out the front of the bowl as the front rim of the pelvis lowers, rotating down. The back lifts up, rotating forward. This will increase lumbar curve of the spine. Think of Donald Duck with his exaggerated spinal curvature. A posterior tilt is when the water pours out the back of the bowl as the back of the pelvis rotates downward and the front lifts up, rotating back. Lumbar curve decreases. Think of a dog with its tail between its legs. A neutral pelvis varies from person to person. Essentially, it is somewhere between both ends ranges of motion where it feels most comfortable. Neutral can and will change as the length-tension relationship of muscles attaching to the pelvis changes. Now let's try a pelvic tilt test. The goal is to tilt the pelvis in either direction, anterior and posterior, independent of the rib cage and the knees moving. The movement should be smooth, fluid, and purposeful. If you have difficulty, practice in front of a mirror so you can both see and feel what the body is doing. Range of motion may be initially small. With practice, it will increase. I know this sounds simple, but you'd be amazed by how many people have difficulty with this movement. The pelvis is not meant to be perfectly level front to back. The body is designed to have some tilt, anterior tilt. Generally speaking, men have less tilt relative to women. It's only by a few degrees, but it does exist. An excess anterior tilt, typically the result of muscle length tension imbalances, involves tight hip flexors, tight lumbar extensors, weak lower abdominal fibers, and weak glutes. Improper pelvic positioning is typically caused by poor exercise technique, inappropriate exercise selection, and too much sitting. In today's society, it's incredibly common to see an excess amount of anterior tilt, especially in women. This places great stress on the lumbar spine, decreases movement performance, and increases the risk of injury. The purpose then for this exercise is to increase awareness of pelvic position, be able to self-correct this position, and maintain neutral as required during movement. For most people, this exercise and its progressions will prove to be more challenging than it would appear. Let's begin with placement of the stabilizer. Start lying supine or face up on the floor with your feet flat and pulled in towards your glutes. Both the feet and the knees are hip width apart. Fully deflated, fold the bladder. Place it horizontally under the spine, across the lower back at the level of L3, or directly under your belly button. The hose should exit from the top of the bladder on the side that you will hold the gauge. The bladder will supply precise feedback as to how well you're performing the exercise. As you can also imagine, with the inflated bladder underneath your lumbar spine, it will prevent you from fully flattening the spine. And you don't want a flat spine. If you exercise with a flat spine, especially during typical abdominal exercises, the body will begin to retrain itself and think flat is normal. A flat spine, especially, is less capable of resisting the forces of extension, compression, shearing, and torque. This is a bad thing. A flat spine also inhibits your ability to move optimally. Also a bad thing. With the bladder in place and lying on your back, hold the gauge so you can easily read it while keeping the head in a neutral position. The other arm should lie on the floor, out to the side, palm up. So let's actually use the stabilizer. Take a breath. Allow the rib cage to lift and slightly grab the floor with your shoulders. The chest should remain a bit elevated. Think of opening up your chest, leading with your sternum. You may notice an increase in lumbar space with the chest in this neutral position. Close the valve on the gauge. While relaxed and breathing comfortably, inflate the bladder until it hits 40 millimeters of pressure. Next, increase the pressure to 70 millimeters by placing a posterior tilt into the pelvis. Think of flattening the lumbar spine. You want to reach 70 millimeters of pressure by rotating the pelvis without the rib cage moving. It's not uncommon for individuals to crunch in an attempt to control the pelvis. This is a poor functional movement compensation. With the needle at 70, you should be able to breathe easily and comfortably. For some, this itself is an effort. For those, use this as an exercise. Maintain the tilt and pressure while breathing. Perform 2 to 3 sets of 10 reps multiple times a day. Each rep can last 2 to 3 breaths. Assuming you can hold the pressure properly, let's progress to a lower abdominal coordination. With the needle moving no more than plus or minus 5 millimeters from 70, flex the right hip, lifting the foot off the floor. Don't flex the hip beyond 90 degrees. Stop the thigh perpendicular to the floor. Lower the leg in a controlled manner, touching the heel down, then reverse direction. Aim for up to 20 reps, performed at a breathing tempo. Inhale as you lift the leg, exhale as you lower the leg, and no holding your breath. Perform your reps, switch legs, and repeat. If you notice that the pressure on the gauge drops as you move the leg, your pelvis is rotating forward, lifting the spine, decreasing pressure on the bladder. This means you don't have control of your pelvis. If you notice the pressure increasing, you still don't have control. You're flexing the hip either too much, beyond perpendicular, hitting end range of motion which forces the pelvis to rotate and the lumbar spine to flatten, or you just don't have adequate control. Be mindful of what your body is doing and self-correct. It's common for one side to be easier than the other. If the difference is significant, a set should start with the weak side, then switch to the strong side, finish with the weak side again. Perform at minimum twice the number of reps until balance is created. You may also notice that the transition or change of direction at the bottom of the movement is most difficult. That's okay. Keep practicing. If you have the coordination to do one leg at a time for reps, let's progress with a modified gait pattern. Everything's the same except you will alternate legs. This is modified, so only one leg will move at a time. Lift your right leg, lower your right leg. Lift your left leg, lower your left leg. And repeat for up to 20 reps each side alternating. You may notice that the transition where you shift from one leg to the other is difficult and hard to maintain the 70 millimeters of pressure. The pelvis should be controlled by the lower abdominals, not you pushing into the floor with the feet from the hip. If you're doing this, stop it. Use your core to stabilize, not your extremities. When you progress, base the progression on the ability of the weak side. If you progress based upon the strong side, the imbalance will continue and increase. Now that you've mastered the modified gait pattern, let's do an actual gait pattern. This time we will adjust the bladder pressure a bit differently. Flex your right hip so the right foot's off the ground. One foot is elevated, the other is flat. Now pump the pressure up to 40 millimeters. Now tilt the pelvis to 70. This is your starting position. One leg up, the other down. It's always harder working from the top down than the bottom up. While keeping the pressure at 70, plus or minus 5, start alternating legs by flexing one hip while extending the other. Both legs should move together just in opposition, starting and finishing together. Start slow. As competency improves, quicken the pace. Just remember to keep breathing. Once you have mastered the gait pattern, it's time to increase difficulty even further. The easiest way to increase difficulty is to slowly lengthen the lever segments, that is, your legs. Rather than having your knee flexed to roughly 90 degrees, start extending it a little at a time. Just remember to keep the amount of knee flexion the same throughout the rep. The goal is to work up to both legs fully extended with pelvic control in a gait pattern. This is very difficult. So in conclusion, think about what you just did, what these progressions are asking you to do. The goal is to move your femur through a full range of motion without your pelvis moving. If the pelvis moves, the lumbar spine moves and energy is leaking out all over the place. This is not what you want. If this is happening on the floor, lying on your back, imagine what is taking place when you're walking, running, sprinting, or performing any other movement on your feet? Is it any wonder we have so many overuse injuries, much less those who don't respond to traditional rehab techniques? I will admit that as you go through upright gait patterns and other movements, the pelvis is expected to move. This movement is controlled with mechanical purpose, not because the body is weak, unbalanced, and out of control. Poor pelvic function is a huge causal factor in injuries, not just the lower back, but the joints both above and below. To be honest, outside of an acute trauma to a joint, practically every overuse injury likely has, to some degree, poor core function, especially the inner unit, as a contributing factor. Proper core function will allow you to perform at a very high level if trained appropriately, decrease the risk of injury, increase the success of rehabbing from injury, lengthen productive longevity within your sport or activity. So thanks again for watching. If you have any questions, just ask, and I'll try to respond as promptly as possible.